Okay, so we'll start with the Nokar mantra. Om Namo Arihantanam. Om Namo Sitanam. Om Namo Ayariyanam. Om Namo Vajayanam. Namo Loe Savasahunam. Eso Panchanamo Karo. Sarva Pavapanasano. Mangalalancha Savesim. Paramam Have Mangalam. Paramam Have Mangalam. Alright. So, does anybody remember where the word Jane comes from? Nope. So the word Jane comes from the word Jina. And who remembers what the word Jina means?
What?
Jina means conqueror or warrior. You conquer your enemies. So we are warriors. Everybody in this building is a warrior. So what are we trying to conquer?
Rebirth.
Close, yeah. We're trying to conquer our emotions, our passions. And that helps us get out of the cycle of life and death. So the first thing we try to do when we conquer an enemy is to what? Understand it. We have to know what we're dealing with. We have to know we have to understand our enemy, as Sun Tzu would say, who wrote The Art of War. But most people don't understand their enemy. I mean, most people here don't understand that they're fighting a battle against their kashayas, or emotions. So today we're going to try to understand our emotions. So can anybody tell me, does anybody want to take a stab at defining what emotions are?
A feeling?
A feeling. Great. That's a synonym. But we want to try to take a stab at defining what it is.
Like a scientific way, like a neurological response?
Any way you want.
Like,
Any way you want.
Oh, so when you have an attachment to something,
Right.
it does some behavior.
Uh-huh.
You're gonna have a reaction against a reaction, so you're gonna get a reaction. That's your feeling.
Great. That's almost perfect. A little bit of a trick question, because emotion is extremely hard to define even for scientists, and scientists don't agree right now. But that's very good with what we understand now. Here's what we know so far. An emotion is a conscious experience characterized by intense mental activity and a certain degree of pleasure or displeasure. So that's pretty broad, okay? But that's all we know. And that's almost anything, okay? A conscious experience, okay? Everything's a conscious experience. Characterized by intense mental activity. Okay, great. So that means we're not sleeping, okay? So intense mental activity. And a certain degree of pleasure or displeasure. So that's where it comes in. It's either subjectively good or subjectively bad. So it's some kind of experience that you are subjectively have a good feeling about or a bad feeling about. Scientific discourse has drifted into other meanings, but there's no common definition of emotion. It's a real problem in the field, especially if you devote your life to studying something and you actually don't even have a good definition, working definition of what it is. So here's where you were very close. According to some theories, they are internal states. Okay, so you're internal, whatever that means, mind or body or both, is in some particular configuration, internal states that result in physical and psychological changes that influence our behavior. So that's key. So it's something about what's going on in here that influences my actions with the outside world. The physiology of emotion is closely linked to arousal of the nervous system, like you said, with various states and strengths. So it could be weak or it could be strong, but if you would take a look at me, all you would say is that, oh, your nervous system is very aroused. You couldn't tell like whether that was good or bad. You would need me to tell you about that. Here's the interesting part. emotion is often the driving force behind motivation, positive or negative. Now that's not really intuitive. Hey, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Hey, you didn't have a book last time, right? I brought you a book.
Okay.
You get to choose.
Do I? Which one involves less work?
This one's less work.
Okay.
And you have a book, right?
Yeah, I have
Okay,
one.
great. So today we're talking about our emotions, because the word Jane means Gina, comes from the word Gina, and Gina means conquer, and what are we trying to conquer is our emotions. Right? So you want to take a stab at defining what emotions are?
Well, I think the best way to describe them are the emotions itself, like anger, joy.
Right, right. But
Uh,
that you're describing different emotions, but you're not. What do they all have in common? That would be the definition of emotion.
let me look it up.
Okay, no problem. If you look it up, you'll have a million different definitions, because we actually don't have a good definition of emotions. It's a trick question for you. It's an arousal of your nervous system, either in the good or bad direction. That's really broad, and that just describes what life and consciousness is. Hey, how you doing?
Sorry for being late.
Oh, no problem. Come on in. So this is not intuitive, okay? Emotion is often the driving force behind motivation, positive or negative. That means whenever you do something, there's some emotion behind it. Now, is that true in your experience? Do you do things because of emotions?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. So what are some examples where you don't? Because then this would be false, right? What are some examples of things that you do that do not involve emotions, that are not motivated by emotions?
So maybe like financial decisions are fundamental, like it's a fact proven thing.
Mhm.
There's maybe no emotion attached to doing that because it's a mathematical problem, maybe, you know?
But your motivation to doing so is security and happiness. You want to experience a future emotion, so you make those financial decisions. So couldn't you say that those would be the motivations behind that?
Sometimes it's not happiness making those decisions.
Well, happiness is not the only emotion, right? It's security. It's you want a better life for your future. But why do you want a better life? It's so you can experience better emotional states, right?
Alright, what about brushing your teeth?
Brushing your teeth. You don't want to experience the pain of tooth decay.
So,
But every day,
Well,
morning,
that's-
that's not the emotion behind doing the.
But what we're talking about is emotion is often the driving force behind motivation. The motivation to brush your teeth was to prevent a bad emotion.
eventually.
Right.
Not knowing in the next week or two, but
Right.
Yeah.
But if I tell a kid never to brush, he may never have any problems. Until he gets the
You'll
pain.
always have problems until he gets the pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he did it without emotion initially. He felt
He did
the
it
pain.
because of fear, because you're telling him. He
Well,
doesn't want to
This
experience
is how-
fear.
What if I didn't tell him? Even when I tell him, I don't tell him he's gonna get germs in his teeth. I just tell him you have to brush your teeth.
Hmm. But isn't there a threat behind that?
Only when he felt it. We as all individuals would have continued. Someone guides you, tells you just do it, right? So you did it without any.
Hmm.
You don't like to. No kid likes to do it, but they do it because the person told them, and then eventually.
Wait, no, they don't do it because a person tells them.
Well.
They do it because they don't want to be punished, they don't want to be grounded, they don't want to take the Xbox away, they don't want to... Because they know from prior experience with you, your kid knows that, oh, something's going to happen if I don't listen to this guy, right?
And as they grow up, they eventually understand when dentists visit school and
That's what I'm saying.
When they have to pay for it.
Yeah. Until that pain. Until that pain came. Until that, it was not emotional. Wow.
So what about? Go ahead.
No, that's it.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, at what point do you have that demarcation? Well, now you understand emotions. Now you don't. But my point was, what about decisions, like say drinking?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know it's not good,
Right.
and you
You
do
do.
it.
You're trying to erase a short-term pain when you drink, right? Or you're trying to feel short-term pleasure by the,
Not really.
by the buzz of drinking, right?
I don't know. I'm just saying, you know the consequences,
Future
Well,
bad consequences.
Future bad consequences, but that's not motivating you to not drink.
But yeah, but short-term good consequences are motivating you to drink.
Yes.
So
So
which
emotion
one-
is still the driver
Positive.
of that action.
Positive. You feel you're gonna get positive, hence you're doing it. You're not looking at the consequences.
But in your example, the kid was looking at the consequences. Right?
He wasn't looking at anything until he felt it. In my case, I'm saying
That's the same thing in drinking.
No,
Not really looking
no.
at anything until you feel it.
no. Well, the adult knows a lot of times that when they have a drink.
No, I don't necessarily want to make a argument. I'm just saying
No,
short-term emotions versus long-term emotions. So the short-term wins here. and
Short-term
long-
almost always wins.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're saying short-term always wins.
Mostly.
Mostly.
Yeah. Because humans have a very short-term bias.
So is that from your subconscious?
I mean, certainly, because you make decisions based on your experiences.
So your subconscious has emotions.
You just say it's a gut reaction, so that's a short term, right?
Yeah.
So
My
which
gut keeps
emotion?
growing, so I don't know if it's short term or not.
So who remembers which emotions that we're concerned about as far as Jainism? Anybody remember? There are four.
Right? Anger, something.
Deceit.
Anger
ego,
is the first one.
Yeah.
Deceit.
Deceit is the third one.
Ego.
Ego is the second one.
Greed.
And greed is the fourth one. That's right. And the reason that they're in a particular order is because you get rid of them in that order. You don't get rid of greed first because they're building blocks on each other. And if you mess up on one, you could go all the way back down to the beginning and have to deal with anger again. So for example, if you got rid of everything but you still have greed, and then that greed causes, let's say, a terrible financial decision, then you could float all the way back down to anger, which you thought you had under control, but now you don't anymore. Hi, how are you doing?
Good.
We're talking about emotions today,
Oh, great.
and how we conquer them. Because that is ultimately what everybody wants to do. That's why we're Jains, because Jain means conqueror. Yes.
Going back to the emotions, how do you create emotion? The first thing. It doesn't come like this.
Right. So what's interesting is that emotions can be created from external circumstances or from internal circumstances. You could have no stimulus or non-trivial stimulus from the outside world. You could just be sitting here, and because you think about a certain thing, then you get angry, right? So both external and internal stimulus
get angry?
create
How do you
cause
get angry?
emotions. So that's what the definition is, right? That's
No.
why it's ill-timed. It's an increased central nervous system activity.
Now, how do you get angry? Because of some of the reactions in your body, right?
That's right. So actually,
And
so that's when we talk about internal states. So sometimes it's a physical thing, and sometimes it's a mental thing, and it's an interplay between the two.
Does it connect to food? What you eat?
Certainly, yeah. And a lot of times, food is so important to us. A lot of us have different emotions about food.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my kids not to be emotional eaters, right? To console themselves with food when they're feeling bad, right? So if we go to page 88 of our book, I know we don't crack the book open much, but today we're going to crack the book open because the book has a lot to say about it.
I don't have my glasses.
If we can,
Next time
so here's where we talk about our emotions. So kind of my goal for this class is to teach you, is to get you to understand that this is all true, because the hardest thing to do, I know because I've experienced it, is to crack open this book when we're not in class and to just not leave it on the shelf when we're at home. So my goal is to convince you that all of this is true, and if I can get you to crack open this book one time when you're not in class, then this whole thing will have been worth it for me. Because it's so hard, because you have your life, you have your kids, you have your job, you have everything. So why would you have pleasure reading, so why would you ever crack open this book? I'm trying to convince you that the things in this book are so much more interesting than whatever's on Netflix, than whatever's going on in your pleasure books, than whatever's going on when you read articles on the internet. The things in this book are much more deserving of your time. So I'm going to point out kind of the different things. There's a lot of good things in here, but there's some things that are really good. and some things that are counterintuitive. So we're talking about anger, ego, deceit, and greed. Those are our enemies. Those are the emotions that we're trying to conquer. So remember from one of our previous classes about anger, is that all anger is directed at yourself. And we can talk later after the class or another time if you don't believe me. If you want to tell me sometime you got angry where you weren't angry at yourself. But hopefully I convinced everybody that was here that whenever you get angry for any reason, that anger is always directed at yourself. And hey, how you doing? Come on in. We're talking about emotions today. Remember the 4 emotions we're trying to conquer?
Not really.
Krodh, Man, Maya, and Lo. Do you remember what those stand for?
Vaguely.
Anger, ego, deceit, and greed. So we're cracking open the book and we're talking about, I'm going to point to you different things that I thought were interesting about this book. So after we understood that all anger is directed at yourself, here's the one thing that's pretty counterintuitive. Forgiveness is heroic and brave. We're on page 89, the 4th bullet point. Forgiveness is heroic and brave. Forgiveness is strength, and anger is weakness. Now, who believes that? I mean, to forgive somebody, you're braver to forgive somebody, you're stronger to forgive somebody. Isn't that pretty counterintuitive? Does anybody believe that?
Sometimes.
Sometimes?
It's like saying it's a bigger man, right?
Right.
It's a bigger man to do something right versus.
Right.
I guess it depends on the reason you're angry.
Okay.
The reason to forgive.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a small thing, it's fine. If it's a big thing, I guess it's not.
But how is it stronger to forgive somebody than to be angry at them?
Oh.
Or how is it more heroic? Or how are you considered more brave if you forgive somebody rather than if you get angry at them?
It's actually easier to get angry on somebody, I would say. I mean, it's a split-second reaction that
Right.
your kid is troubling you and you're doing something important. At that point in time, it's very easy to get angry.
Right.
And then you may even burst out. After some time, you will realize that, you know what, I didn't do. And that is the smaller thing. I mean, you would immediately forgive. But take that same thing in at workplace.
Mm-hmm.
It sometimes becomes difficult to let go somebody who's, you know, stood against you or said something about you in a meeting or maybe to your boss or something.
Right.
That part, I think, to get angry is very, very common, and I would say it's very human. But to forgive somebody after going through something is very difficult.
That's why. That's exactly why. Because it's so much more harder to forgive because forgiveness is not a basic emotion. Now, when I told you that we don't have a good definition of emotions, we also, if you look it up, there's not even a good definition of the number of basic emotions. Anger is something that everybody agrees on. But one scientist says there are 6 emotions, one scientist says 8, one scientist says 15. But anger is all one of them. And that means it's very easy to get into those states. Forgiveness is never a basic emotion. It's only a reasoned emotion, or sometimes what's called a tertiary or secondary emotion. And that's why it's much more brave. That's why you're much more heroic to forgive, because it's easy to slip into anger, and it's very, very difficult to forgive somebody, and that's why it's considered. That's why you're considered stronger when you forgive somebody. And remember, I just told you the answer to this question. Who are you forgiving? Yourself. All anger is directed at yourself. So when you forgive somebody else, you're actually forgiving yourself. Okay? And and that's why we call it conquering yourself. When you conquer these emotions, you conquer yourself. That's why Sun Tzu said, I don't care about 1,000 people. Just give me 100 people that have conquered themselves and I can rule the world. Okay, that's how hard it is to forgive yourself. It should be, when I phrase it like that, it should be the easiest thing in the world to forgive yourself. Okay, but we don't understand that we're angry at ourselves, and when we forgive other people, we're forgiving ourselves. So the next one we're going to talk about is ego, and then the book talks about humility because it's the opposite of ego. So here's what was counterintuitive about humility. One of the ways to practice humility is to see the positive side of people. Okay, but how is that practicing humility? If I look at you and say, "Oh, that's great. You know, you're a great person because of X, Y, and Z." Well, how is that practicing humility? This, I think, is a very subtle point, and the book just says it like that, and like you might not understand why. It is practicing humility to see the positive side of people, because it is to recognize that people both have positive and negative sides, okay? Well, if I recognize that you have a positive and negative side, I am admitting to myself that I have a positive and a negative side. Most people are not willing to admit that they have a negative side. And if I choose to concentrate on your positive side, what I am asking you to do is for you to concentrate on my positive side. And if I am asking you to concentrate on my positive side, I am admitting to you that I have a negative side, just like everybody else. And please overlook that because my intentions are good. That's why it's humble, because you're admitting to yourself and you're admitting to other people that you have a negative side. So when you focus on that's why, and this is all goes on, unless I state it to you explicitly, this goes all underneath in what's called subcommunication between people. When you talk to somebody, you know, people say 90% of communication is your body language and your subcommunication and the tone you use and the way you speak and the way your body moves. Well, this is one of those things that until I make it explicit to you, you don't understand how it works between the interaction between you and your person. If I'm talking with you and I focus on your positive side, what I am saying to you in my subcommunication is I'm a humble person and I have a negative side, and I want you to overlook my negative side because everybody has a negative side. That's why it's humbling. That's why it's a practicing of humility to look at the positive characteristics of somebody else. So next we talk about straightforwardness, which is the opposite of deceit. And here, the interesting thing about straightforwardness is what you want to be, and what you can look up when you're at home, is how to be a congruent person. Does anybody know what being a congruent person is?
Is that the same sides?
Correct. So a congruent person, his actions conform with his speech, and that conforms with his thoughts.
So you do what you say?
Exactly. You do what you say, and you say what you think. Right? And all of that is good. Okay? So, and this again is what we subcommunicate between people. We all know, like, some people aren't credible, but we can't very explicitly say why. Well, we know, like, he's a phony guy or he's a funny guy. He doesn't mean what he says, you know. But we can't really explain why a lot of the times because we subcommunicate these things when we're talking to people. But one way we can tell, sometimes you meet somebody that you instantly respect, you know, and maybe you can't put your finger on it. But it's because that person is congruent, where you can, that person, his actions comport with what he says, and then you can tell that his thinking comports with what he says also. And that gives you a respect for that person. And that means that he's congruent. And so when we talk about right knowledge, right faith, right action, I mean, that's the modern version of what we're talking about. We're talking about a congruent person. And there are all sorts of books that will kind of explain this to you and tell you what congruency means. So that's the interesting thing about, that's what straightforwardness is, right? So that's when you can tell, that's the opposite of deceit. So when you can tell somebody, if you meet somebody and you're like, that's a stand-up guy, you know, now you know why. Because he's practicing one of these things, this congruency item. Questions so far?
Is deceit a basic human tendency?
No, out of all the things, out of all the emotions that I've looked at, deceit is not one of them.
I would think that, survival is a basic human instinct. And for you to survive, you have to have some form of deceit. Maybe from an animalistic standpoint, I'm not saying from Jainism
Right.
standpoint,
Yeah.
but evolutionary standpoint, I was just thinking, is deceit a basic human necessity?
Maybe, but let's first start off with saying, well, it's not really an emotion, and there's a survival instinct, but that's not ever classified as an emotion, right? A single emotion. So let's get that out of the way first. But now let's go to your question. Well, is deceit a necessity in order to survive? Anybody have any thoughts?
One thing we have learned over the right or wrong, I don't think it's that right that I've been taught, I guess, in childhood, and survival of the fittest,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you always have to compete. I mean, you to do
Good
it's
example,
been kind of in our ingrained in us that you, whether it's school, whether it's a sports, saying that you always have to better the other people, and for that deceit can come into the play. Now I do think now, knowing more, that it's not necessary. I mean, coexistence in the world overall, if we think about it, it's possible. It doesn't have to be that one have to be powerful than the other, and the powerful survives and the other one don't. But that's how it's being told to us, or that's how it's being preached, or directly or indirectly in past or taught. So that's why it does come to some extent natural. However, it may not be the case. But it just, by training, by education, it might be natural, I think.
That's a good current example. I was thinking more like, the times of hunter-gatherer. Didn't you have to use deceit to survive? That was part of their plan of
Right.
how to gather food, whatever. Civilizations, competing against one another at that time. I was just thinking that it's been a part of human existence for a long time.
Right. So I'd say two things to that. One is that you could make that argument for all what we're talking about, anger, ego, deceit, and greed. But that doesn't mean we don't try to overcome it. And two, when you say survival, you are focused in on the short term because you think that survival is everything. But we know in Jainism that you're on to your next life once you get rid of this life, right?
Sure.
So when you say deceit is necessary for survival, I would push back and say, no, it's not even, your soul is still gonna survive, your soul is still gonna go around in the cycle of life and death, whether you practice deceit or not. And kind of the third thing I would say is, it's kind of easy to say that in the abstract, but it's hard to come up with an example where it would actually be necessary for your survival and where you couldn't do something else. So I would say those three things. Anybody else?
I think key point here is you're making a survival, right? I mean, we are always try to better ourselves than just survival. Whether it's, migrating from India to US or anything like that. We want to better it. And I completely agree. I think the survival will be done with the minimal things, and that's how I think sadhu sadhvi and everybody does.
Right.
And we obviously in a race to get better and better things, whether it's materialistic things or physical things. But yeah, I think that's the difference. Survival versus the I don't have a opposite to it, the word, but
Right.
I think it's probably because of that.
So let's give an example. In the modern time, when is it necessary to deceive somebody just to survive this life, let's say? Not in a hunter-gatherer time.
only practical example I can think of, it's like, for example, if somebody's gonna attack you,
Right.
and you want to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, let's say even an animal, and you are somehow in the close proximity, and you have to deceive yourself so that you can save yourself to be survival. That's the only I can think.
So I'll tell you two things. One is from a layperson perspective, and one is from, let's say, a sadhu, sadhvi, tirthankar's perspective. The first one is that if you deceive somebody in order to save your life so you can presumably do more nirjara later, okay, that's going to attract some karma, but a very fine amount that won't attach to your soul as strongly. It's kind of like the self-defense mechanism in the court of law. Yes, I deceived them, but I needed to. And that works because that karma you get for deceiving somebody doesn't attach to your soul as strongly, and it's a much smaller amount. Okay, so that's from the layperson's perspective. From the sadhu, sadhvi, tirthankar's perspective, they would say, it's not worth it. I know I'm going to continue in the next life. I know I'm going to have another chance. It's not worth it. I have conduct myself to a higher standard than lay people. And if I die, I'm fine with it. Everybody dies. I'm not attached to this life. Okay? And if I die, well, maybe it was my time. Maybe that's when I know my ayusha karma is running out. So I would say those two things to that. So the next one is greed in the book here. And here is something that this book just says things that are so crazy. It's on page 93, the first sentence, and you can really think about it for a long time. Here it is. Somebody tell me what this means. Greed is due to being unaware that the self and the non-self are different. What does that mean?
I'm guessing self is you and non-self is the other person, but I don't really understand that because in terms of a human being, it's
Right.
self is self, we are the other person.
Almost,
Really?
almost feels like it's talking of multiple personalities within the same person.
Greed is due to being unaware that the self and the non-self are different.
So self is your soul? Is that what it is?
You tell me.
I don't know. I'm
No,
asking.
you create a scenario where this sentence makes sense. You create it.
Well, when you compare an individual, right? He's self and non-self. They have something.
So let's
They
say
don't
the
have
self.
same.
So let's say two scenarios. The self is you, and the non-self is me. So how does that make sense in this sense, in that scenario?
So we don't
If
have
you are unaware that you are different from me,
unaware.
yeah. How does greed arise from it?
That means you're just taking away from yourself. Let's say if I'm not aware that we are me and you are the same thing, I'm just taking it for myself.
Right. So there's two ways to look at it. One is that it might mean that greed is due to being unaware that the body and soul are different. So remember, the soul is ourself, and the body is not ourself. So when you practice greed, you're doing all these things for your body. You're gaining money for your body. You're gaining, fame and fortune for your body, beauty, power, name, pleasures for the five senses for your body. And that has nothing to do with your soul. That doesn't nourish your soul. It's unproductive activities. It's unproductive for your entire life because you're not doing anything productive to your soul. So that might be what it means. But I think it means something much more profound and something much more subtle. It means that not being aware that yourself and the model of you that others have in their head are different. So I'm myself, I have a picture of myself, I know what's going on with myself. But there resides a Timer in each one of your brains. You have constructed a model of me in your head, and he looks like this, he talks like this, he acts like this, he thinks like this. Now, if I'm more concerned about the model of myself that's in each one of your heads, if I don't realize that that's a cartoon, that that's not reality, what I will do is succumb to greed. because I will get a nice house in order to make that model look good. I will get a nice car in order to make that model look good. I will get a beautiful life and a beautiful kids and beautiful money. I won't ever admit to you that I make a mistake. I won't ever be humble in front of you. I won't admit, all in order to spruce that image up, to maintain that reputation of myself in your head, which is not real. So if I'm unaware, some people say that perception is everything, right? How you perceive me is how I am, regardless of the reality of who I am. So that's, I think, what this means. If you're unaware that the self and the non-self are different, you'll succumb to this greed. Because the person that is aware that the model of thin air in your head is different than the reality, that means I don't care about what you think about me. I don't care about sprucing up that model in your head. And I won't succumb to that greed. So now let's read it again with that in mind. Greed is due to being unaware that the self and the non-self are different. So I think that's how that makes sense. It's at the top of page 93.
We have
I think some books.
Oh, some books are different? I'm so sorry.
97, maybe.
We're at the section called Santosh, contentment. And it's the third paragraph of that.
Great is due to being unaware.
Yeah.
It's on page 96 of this book.
I'm
95.
sorry about that, yeah. So I think that's what that means. Any thoughts or comments on that?
Greediness is a prison. It's a bondage.
Yeah, here's the thing I thought was amazing, okay? All the rice and barley of the entire earth, all the stocks of gold and all the cattle of earth are not sufficient to satisfy the desires of a single individual. Okay, I have enough greed in myself that if I could capture all the power of the earth, I would still want more. If I could capture all the power of the universe, all the wealth, all the energy of the universe, I could still want more. So that's how you know these emotion things are bunk. That's how you'll know you'll never be satisfied. That's how you'll know you'll spend your life on what's called the hedonic treadmill. Anybody know? You laugh? You know what the hedonic treadmill
No,
is?
I'm just imagining something with constant running and never.
Exact. That's what the hedonic treadmill is. Okay, it's when you get a raise, then you adjust your lifestyle to make to that amount of money, and then you're not happy. You want another raise. Oh, you just took one couple more steps on the treadmill. When you get this and you have it, you're not happy anymore. You return to your baseline of happiness, and you're pushing yourself on the treadmill, right? And so your whole life, you're just going faster and faster on this treadmill. This is called the hedonic treadmill. You're just after pursuits. That's how you know that all this emotion thing, that all this hedonism is bunk. Because every one of us would not be satisfied with all, if we were to let our greed take its course, we would not be satisfied with every physical thing in the universe. Okay, so if you wanted proof, there's your proof.
So what are you supposed to do? Quit your
Yeah.
job? Quit your
So
job?
No, be happy with what you have. And once you have a certain amount of money to take care of some basic things, then turn your pursuits to spiritual goals now that the material goals have been taken care of. If you have enough money, let's say, and you work hard enough to give yourself X hours a week of free time, use that free time for your spiritual goals. Don't use that free time to get more money, and then so you have less time in the future, because that's not the point.
So does it also mean to say that it's okay to be greedy for a little bit and then you leave your greediness, be happy and jump
Well,
into the spiritual side?
it would be okay to be greedy in order to get yourself more time to do nirjara. Right? And that's one of the...
It is?
It's okay at the bottom steps, okay? But later on in the path, it's not okay. Let's see. Because...
I think I'm bottom.
Yeah, I would.
steps here.
Oh, so my advice to Jainism's advice to people is always different depending on what step you're at. Remember, like I made the distinction between lay people and sadhus and sadhvis and tirthankars? They can do things that we cannot because they are further along on the path. So your advice is always different depending on where you are. And some people don't like that, but that's the way it is.
But let's just as a greed, for example, or santosh, right? I think it's
Yeah, santosh is contentment, which
I-
is the opposite of greed.
right.
Right.
So our training, whether it's called schooling or I mean, every time if you grade like in whether it's India or US, whether it's a or B grade or you talk about something,
Mm-hmm.
and you always think, okay, what can we do to do better than this? It's what I want to make a point is our basic training that we get in our early part of life. It's always not signifying santosh. I would say
Right.
it's always like, oh,
Do not settle, right?
exactly. When
This is like a theme for all like sports
Be
teams
competitive.
and
Yeah.
Right.
corporate and do not settle.
Get more grades, better
It's actually
grades.
counterintuitive.
Well, when you're talking about kids and adults, our advice to kids is always different than the advice we give to adults. Because first we have to get over these basic hurdles.
But what we get as a kid becomes our sanskar, and once that kind of is ingrained in us, as an adult, it's like almost bad habits, right? I mean, once you get the habit in, it's difficult to change the habit or almost get away with it,
Right.
versus developing something different, and it's almost opposite.
I agree with everything
You
that-
somehow have to take a U-turn, and it
Right.
gets
I can
more
tell you
challenging.
that every Sunday, I see this in our there, sir.
yeah.
And it has nothing to do with money. The greed and santosh thing has nothing to do with money. I see people start taking food, and they'll take one more piece of something because they think they will not get it at the end.
Yes.
If they ask for a second, right? So consider that greed, and they're not. They have no santosh because they think they need more, right? And so there's someone that doesn't get it, maybe.
Yeah.
Right? So they're taking away from someone else in some sense, right?
True.
So, I mean, whenever we think of greed, we think of money, right? Like you don't think of other items like that, but it's like, it's food, right? It's different, So, and these are adults, these are not just kids, right? The kids are like, well, let me try it and I'll come back if I want more, right? So, that's ingrained in us.
I agree with what you said. I think you have a very good point because this is where the reality meets the road of life in Jainism, okay? We teach kids one way, and then when they're adults, we ask them to do a U-turn, as you said, and forsake all that and teach them the other way. Now, there's a couple different things we can do to address this, okay? So we can start teaching them the right way, first of all, and trust that they will still lead a happy and content life with that right way. We could teach them to be, we could teach them more to be like a sadhu or sadhvi growing up, and teach them that that is the path to spiritual happiness. Or we could teach them that we could understand that you give different advice to different people based on their age and based on where they're at. And we understand that, and we try to get in that U-turn earlier and earlier. Like while they're here, while they're in our house, instead of trying to talk to them as adults after bad habits supposedly have already set in.
Yeah.
Okay? And I think kids are much more aware of contradictions than we think that they are. They're much more ahead of, oh, it's like that, and like that sucks, and then we just have to do it because these things are opposite. They're much more able to hold that in their head than we think they are. Okay? And then if you tell your child, like, this is how it is in life, and this is how it applies when you learn something at the Derasar, and we try to bring the two together, I think they will understand that.
Just one note on that.
Yeah.
Like telling the kids early about this santosh, or living with for survival and not
Right.
for luxuries.
Right.
So there are examples. Let's say if their parents smart enough, and let's say they want rather than taking a U-turn, they want to start their kids early into the path of or doing the right things. Let's say, and somehow they end up with diksha for the kids at a young age. And, let's for a second, if we think that's the right thing to do, to get the kids started early on that path. But the general perception, if 10, 15-year-old does a diksha, we think, oh, their parents are so cruel. I mean, they don't want to let their kids have a life.
Right.
They don't even know enough.
Right.
Why do I mean, until this point when we just talked about it.
But
that we
why
can-
would you care what other parents think if you know what's best for your kid?
Right. But to be honest, I can be guilty myself
Sure.
of saying that I didn't do it, but somebody else did it. For example, you send your child on that path, and I'm like, what is Timur thinking? You know, this child doesn't even know
Right.
better about anything, and he's sending him on the path of Diksha. So I guess now I feel like that parent or you are smarter than me because you are starting that person early rather than taking you
Right.
to the later
Because
stage.
I have the right faith, the right conduct, and the
Yeah.
right action. So I'm not going to let anybody's thoughts of what I'm doing to my kids bother me if I know it's the
True.
right way. So here we have this spreadsheet, right? It's a 4x4 spreadsheet. On the rows, we have level 0, level 1, level 2, and level 3. And on the columns, we have anger, ego, deceit, and greed. So level 0 is no control. If you have no control over your anger, you're controlled by others. You're controlled by people who use your anger to manipulate you. If you have no control over your ego, you're never satisfied. If you have no control over your deceit, you suffer the consequences of living a life of not being trusted by anybody or accepted by anybody. Those are social consequences, and they're legal consequences. It's illegal to lie in some circumstances, and you'll suffer those consequences if you're full of deceit. If you have no control over your greed, you suffer the consequences of taking too many risks. There are social consequences to taking too many risks, financial consequences to taking too many risks, and of course legal consequences if you skirt the law because of your greed. So level 1 is where some of us might be at. What we want to do is experience the emotion and redirect it into a productive activity. Now all these productive activities are not necessarily good according to Jainism, but we're at level 1, we're giving different advice than the person at level 2, and we're giving different advice than the person at level 3. If you experience anger and you're at level 1, channel your anger into physical exercise. Best way to do it, okay? Best way to do it, go running, lift some weights. You're too tired to be angry, your brain's going to let it go.
Can I, sorry.
Yeah.
I've long struggled with this idea of turning your other cheek. Somebody harms you,
Right.
you get angry, and that's how do you do that when you have been harmed at different levels? You've been fired, or you obviously feel unjustly or wrongly, and I'm giving very simple examples.
Sure.
There are very complicated and really bad examples, murders, assaults. I mean, these are real life issues where people struggle on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
And just to say, turn your other cheek or channel your anger in exercises, I think belittles the emotional trauma they are going through. Don't you think?
No, I don't think so. Emotions are our enemies and we try to combat them. Okay? So whenever you get angry, you have to look at the big picture. You have to understand why you got angry, why it's your fault you're getting angry, and why that anger is directed at yourself. And what you can do about it, or if anything, and what is under your control about that anger. So let's say you got fired, okay? And you're angry. Well, you have to look at what is it, maybe it was my karma. Maybe I can look at it as an opportunity to do something else that I've always wanted to do. Maybe I can look at it as instead of being angry at the person that fired me, maybe I can look and see, well, was there a valid reason? Or was there, let's say it was budget cuts. Say, well, okay, that was a sinking ship, now is the time for me to find a better one. Let's say somebody in my family gets killed because of a homicide, and I'm angry at that person. Well, I could say, actually, let's say it's my child who died. Well, my child's soul has now moved on to the next life. There's no reason for me to be angry about that. I'm not supposed to be attached to my children and wife. Okay? There's no reason for me to be angry about that. That person will get his just desserts in the form of karma. So there's no reason for me to be angry about retribution. Okay? So what you try to do is remind yourself of why you're getting angry, who you're getting angry at, and why it's wrong to be angry.
When you say that last part of the person will get his retribution or karma, is that not like, oh, he'll get his dues? Some feeling, right? He will get his what he deserves.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with me. If somebody kills my child, it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with that person and my child. It may have been that my child, his time was up because he is supposed to go to the 7th level of heaven right then. It may have been that. It had nothing to do with me.
My couple of thoughts there is, I would never think that, oh, because this person did something wrong to me, that person will get his own karmas, because then that's my ego that, oh, because they did something to me, okay, I'm not doing anything, I'm forgiving, forgetting, but they'll meet their consequences. That thought cultivating, I think it's wrong in my mind. And then to your question, I do agree, it's tough and difficult, but at small things, if you start practicing, like very simple things, like waiting in traffic, are you angry? Honking, cutting lanes, going, talk about food example, talk about other examples. So that cultivates and gets you to that stage. If you start
Flourish, that's why we talk about forgiveness is much harder. It takes a much stronger person to forgive.
I
than to
fully
be angry.
understand that, but I just think at some point you say, it's not about me. You give the example of the child getting killed. Okay, I'm hurt, fine, but how am I supposed to just forgive that person? It's not about me. How am I supposed to forgive that person who just killed my child?
You're supposed to forgive them by understanding that it has nothing to do with you. Whatever kind of karma they have going on with themselves will punish or reward them accordingly.
So, okay, would that mean I don't just let it go? If there is, we have criminal justice system here, and there's stuff going on. I just say, you know what, I don't want to deal with this anymore, or I'm not going to cooperate. I'm not going to do anything. Is that how you deal with it?
You don't press charges. You don't file.
You don't press charges, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you two examples, two pieces of advice. Okay, one at a layperson level, and one at a sadhu, sadhvi, tirthankar level. Okay, at the layperson level, you deal with your anger by yourself. Okay, with the help of your support system, right? And you do. Let's say you saw it. Okay, you do testify against the person, and you realize that it's that person's that bad karma is going to catch up with him, but you have to. But ultimately, you're going to have to work through your grief and your anger and let it go. And on the sadhu sadhvi level, the tirthankar level, what they would do is they would be equanimous about the whole thing, because they realize that it's their attachment that is what is causing them to do that. And they wouldn't press charges. It has nothing to do with you, or they wouldn't testify, or they wouldn't do those things because they believe in it so much, right? They're certain of the things that you're not certain about. They're certain that that person will get their reward sooner or later.
But Tamir, don't you think that from a practical standpoint that you're trying to prevent that from happening to someone else? Right? Like, okay, forget, let's say I
Sure, yeah, that's why you testify against the person. Yeah, as a lay person.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, let's say you accept that, okay, fine, your son or daughter is in a better place or whatever. I mean, I don't know if you've ever gone to a funeral of someone that has, like, their child passed away. You know, it's one that I've seen more people attend than any other funeral, just because it's the hardest thing to watch. You know, the parent go through something like that as well, right? So, I mean, you know, those are consequences that people try to avoid for others, right? Like, hey, you know, it happened to me, I don't want it to happen to you, kind of thing.
I hate to cut this short, and we can talk after class, but I think a couple people have got kids that they got to get to at 11:30. So if we want to go through the rest, and then one final thought. So if you're still at level 1 and you're experiencing ego, redirect that into your professional accomplishments. If you're experiencing deceit, experience that and redirect that into strategic life planning, or play deceitful games where it pays to be deceitful and has no consequences, like chess. If you're experiencing greed and want to redirect it, do some investment research and do some entrepreneurial actions instead of trying to cheat somebody, or instead of trying to skirt the law to satisfy your greed. I'm not saying these are good ideas, okay? I'm saying these are ways you can redirect it if you're at that level, okay? If you're at level 2, the opposite of anger is to practice forgiveness. Practice forgiveness in your everyday life. The opposite of ego is to practice humility. Just practice humility in your everyday life. If you're at level 2, the opposite of deceit is straightforwardness, which we talk about. If you're at level 2, the opposite of greed is contentedness, which we talk about. And if you want to prevent all of these things, if you want to prevent anger, you practice mindfulness. If you want to prevent ego, you practice mindfulness. If you want to prevent deceit, you practice mindfulness. And if you want to prevent greed, you practice mindfulness. And that is why I harped upon this almost every other class last year, and you're tired of hearing about it, is because that's how important this is. And so we don't have much time, but I thought I'd leave you with one final thought. We don't get, some parts of Jainism, we get a lot of scientific corroboration. Some parts, like let's say karma, or the existence of minute particles that bond to your soul, we may never get any kind of scientific confirmation. But this is from an article that struck me, that leads me, that I want to share with you, that will corroborate this theory of anger, ego, deceit, and greed. This person interviewed a CIA officer, and the CIA officer said, "At the CIA, where I worked in the Directorate of Operations, we assessed a potential asset's vulnerabilities using the acronym MICE: money, ideology, coercion, and ego. Any good intelligence officer finds a way to use those vulnerabilities to leverage the asset to work on his or her behalf." Okay, this is the best corroboration that you're going to get about this anger, ego, deceit, greed formula. If professionals, there's no better corroboration I could present to you that anger, ego, deceit, and greed are your enemies than telling you that years of experience have led professionals to consider these emotions vulnerabilities in order to exploit people. Okay? I mean, the mapping from mice to Krodman Maya Loeb is almost perfect. Ego is ego, money is greed, coercion and ideology are roughly deceit and anger and outrage. So if you were wondering whether anything we said today was true, well, there you go. Thanks everybody for coming today.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.